John is not only the curator of European art, but he also heads up all the provenance research at the museum, and many of you have heard me describe him as an art detective before, and I think we're going to hear a little bit about why that title is so fitting as he describes a recently restored painting in our collection. Dr. John Marciari.
Thank you all for coming. The painting I'm going to talk about today is this kneeling angel painted around 1480 by the Florentine artist Bernardo di Stefano Rosselli, who's not a famous, he's not a particularly famous artist in historical hindsight. The more famous artist from that family is his cousin Cosimo Rosselli, who did this picture to my right, which Cosimo also worked in the Sistine Chapel, right, most famously, painted one of the frescoes on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. But he and his cousin, Bernardo, shared a workshop, and they both come out of the same training, and they're typical of the mainstream of Florentine art in the last few decades of the 15th century. What I want to concentrate on today, though, is the restoration of this painting and what we learned as a result of that restoration. But I think to get to that, I have to go backwards and talk about why this painting went to the conservation studios in the first place. It was restored at the Balboa Art Conservation Center just here in the park a few months ago. But it initially went there because I was very skeptical of the painting. When I first saw it down in our storerooms, it didn't look half as good as it does now. First of all, it was in a rather awful frame with a big red velvet liner and an ugly wooden box surrounding that. More to the point, though, it had a very thick yellowed varnish on it, and that made the background look almost black. And this is unusual. I couldn't think of another Florentine painting of the time where you would have a saint floating against a black sky, saint kneeling on clouds, but against a black nighttime sky. Simply wouldn't make any sense. And then there were some other oddities in the surface that made me begin to wonder whether it wasn't in fact a forgery made in the 19th century. And so as part of the ongoing process of cataloging our collections, I thought, well, even if it's a fake, we need to send it over for some technical examination. So the painting went off to BACC. Fortunately, once we began looking at it there under bright lights, under the microscope, examining the pigments, it was clear that it is the genuine article, that it is a 15th century Florentine painting. In fact, even before we began any of the technical examination, as soon as we took it out of the old frame and we were able to see the back, now I'd love to be able to just lift it off the wall, but it weighs a ton. It's actually about 2.5 inches thick. As soon as we were able to see the back, we realized that this, there are characteristics of the carpentry that suggest that this is absolutely consistent with what you'd expect for a Florentine painting of the time. Big, thick poplar wood panel. But interestingly, one of the first things you notice is this channel across the bottom. Now, this is an old batten channel. Florentine altarpieces are made up of many planks of wood. They generally run top to bottom. And because the artists and carpenters knew that these panels would over time begin to flex and warp and curve, they would hammer multiple battens across the back. So you have the main planks going this way, and in these dovetail channels, planks of wood that would be hammered in. Now, typically you would have these kind of top and bottom or top, middle, bottom of the set of planks. The fact that we found one running here suggests immediately this is a fragment of a much, much larger work, because it's neither at the bottom, nor at the top, nor straight through the center. It suggests that this was the middle of the painting here, that there was much more below, and still quite a bit above. Now that makes sense if you look at this angel kneeling on clouds. Typically, angels kneel on clouds in the upper parts of pictures, and he or she is looking generally downward. One of the other things we found almost immediately, too, was this little tip of a red wing, which you can barely see poking out from behind the frame here. This had been painted over. It was part of the blue-black sky background. Now, that red wingtip, if you've looked at anything else by Bernardo Rosselli or really any Florentine artist at the time, comes out clearly as one of the tips of these cherubs' wings that you always see in these pictures. These cherubs float in the sky at the tops of these scenes. So we know immediately from that that there must have been at least another foot onto this panel. So much larger, a center here, and then something down below. We had no record of where this had come from prior to its being cut apart. This, though, is a fairly common practice. This is the gist of this panel that we're showing here at the moment, how Renaissance altarpieces were often chopped up to make multiple saleable pictures. So we began cleaning it, and we noticed a few other oddities. One is you generally expect Florentine artists to be absolutely meticulous in their workmanship. They're very careful, very professional, very perfect artists as a general rule. But when Bernardo was painting this, he was actually being slightly quick and sloppy about it. You see, for example, this blue splodge that drips down through the drapery. Yes, that's a technical term, splodge. That drips down through the drapery. This is original. This is the artist painting in the sky, and some drips across, and he doesn't bother to change it. Also, if you look closely, you'll see lots of little dots of blue that are, again, the painting of the sky dripping down onto the main figure. And then even some drops of red. There's one here. There was another that was actually right on the center of the angel's nose that we actually touched out because it was so distracting. That is evidence of the red paint being dripped. Essentially, Bernardo was working quickly, and he knew that this part of the altarpiece would be well over the heads of anyone looking at it, and that these little imperfections wouldn't be seen. But it's unusual to find these kinds of things, and it gives us a slightly human touch for this artist. It also probably relates to the circumstances of patronage. Bernardo worked in Florence, but most of his clientele was out in the provincial cities, in the Chianti Hills, for example, and places like that. And a Florentine artist making something for a church in town has one standard, and something that's going to be sent out to a church in the hills, well, you just don't take quite as much time for that. You don't get quite as much money for that. You don't have quite the prestige for that. And you get the sense of an artist making conscious decisions not to be perfect about every detail for these provincial commissions. Now, what is this angel? I mean, it could be a lot of things. There are plenty of Florentine pictures of the time that show an enthroned virgin with saints on the sides and angels up above looking down in glory. You could even see this above something like a martyrdom of a saint with angels looking on. But one of the other things that came up in the cleaning is this area of a slightly different shade of blue on the left side of the panel. You can see the difference between, and we've left it so you can see the difference between the background and this area that has thinner paint, which previously had all been painted over to make one consistent dark blue color. In the cleaning, that overpaint came off. Not only can you see a different color, but there's actually, you'll see as you look closely, an incised outline that goes up, and you see a kind of outline of a capital and an entablature, and then the beginning of an arch up above. And in X-ray, we see a series of nail holes right down here that have since been filled, because you wouldn't want big gaping holes in the center of your picture. This suggests that this picture was part of what's known in the art historical literature as a build tabernacle, a painting that surrounds another tabernacle. Now, the most famous example of this in the history of art is an altarpiece done by Peter Paul Rubens about 120 years after this picture, where Rubens was asked to paint a surround for a much older icon. That is to say, this old painting here, which predates Rubens by a few hundred years, was a very venerated, almost believed to be miraculous image. But as the church is being modernized, that little icon would be floating in the center of a big altar. So the job of the artist was to take that and put it into a setting with a big altarpiece that would match the other big altarpieces that had then been made for the church. So you have Rubens, and it's a very similar setup, angels in adoration of the older picture with some saints and angels down below. Well, that seems to be what this is, where this tabernacle would have held an older image. What's more is that we know Bernardo became known for doing such pictures. So one of his that survives, for example, is in a little church called Panzano, in a town not so far from Florence, and it's been modified over the years, but essentially this is Bernardo Rosselli's painted surround, angels in the sky, cherub floating on clouds, the old image, and then saints, more cherubs in the foreground. This must have been part of a setup just like this. Somewhere along the way, the framing members were cut apart. We don't know exactly what happened, but that's certainly what this is, and it almost certainly is part of, it certainly tells the story of what this picture originally had been. Now, one of the things about Bernardo is his account book, his list of contracts, expenditures, tasks done, etc., still survives. And it is one of the most complete records of an artist's work in the Renaissance. You know, we may know more about what Bernardo did day to day than we do about any other artist, or at least we will know that once this account book, which is in an archive in Florence, comes to be published. However, the person who discovered this has for some 28 years been saying, and the publication is still forthcoming of the account book. When that is published, or when I can get to Florence to check the account book, presumably one will find documents for additional altarpieces made as surrounds for older icons. So this is still very much a work in progress, but I'm confident, or at least optimistic, that we'll be able to find lists of no more than 3, 4, 5 projects that are the possibilities of when this work was done. So the story is still ongoing. In the meanwhile, having been cleaned, having been taken out of that big, ugly velvet liner frame, we actually found this 19th century frame, probably made when the work was cut apart, perfectly well intact inside the velvet liner. And it makes a nice addition to the gallery's installation, and especially at this moment where we have this group of fragments clustered here together, and we talk about other fragments that have been connected to known altarpieces and projects that have been separated. It's a kind of advertisement for what work is still to come on this picture. So there it is, 10 minutes on Bernardo di Stefano Rosselli. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Oh, John.
Yes?
What do you make of that vegetation? Well, it looks like vegetation to me, there are clouds, but they're almost greenish.
They are, oddly, this is how this artist makes clouds. That's part of the reason I'm confident that they are clouds. And I mean, if you look at this picture, for example, well, it's small here, but this picture seen in detail, they're very, very similar. Let's just say that he hasn't studied them very carefully. Probably what's happened in time, too, is that the white has become more transparent and you're seeing more of the blue through the white, and that's making them look a bit greener. But there's no question that they are meant to be clouds. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming.